Okay, welcome to the first lecture of the second half of the class for this semester. For some reason, my image is now a circle instead of a rectangle. Don't know when this change was made, but no big deal, I guess. You remember the first half of the class, we covered political institutions, and a lot of that stemmed from the Constitution or the ideas that contributed to it, or the specific institutions that the Constitution called for. The second half of the class, we focus on behavior. So what are some of the byproducts of our political system? And this week we start with political parties, which is a little bit unusual because most people would think of political parties as institutions. But the reason we start here is because the Constitution doesn't say anything about political parties. This is actually sort of an effect, if you will, of our political system, which we'll talk about today. So it's something that isn't specifically called for, but something that we sort of generate as a result of how our political system is structured. So let's go ahead and get started. So democratic systems often require decisions to be decided by a collective, right? You need, in most cases, a majority of voters to support an initiative or legislation. And so naturally that gives way in sort of a very social psychological way to the development of these, collective groups that are all trying to accomplish their individual goals. And that's how we have the formation of political parties. Parties are not, as I mentioned at all in the Constitution, but they do exert considerable power over American government here. In fact, if you go back to the Federalist Papers, some of the authors of the Federalist Papers were very concerned when they were looking at how to design our U.S. system of government that you could have these political parties and they could end up sort of running the show. But at the end of the day, the idea is to get like-minded voters aligned into a single group that allows them to have more sort of collective power. They do this by getting people together under what's referred to as a party platform. So a platform is a statement of the values and policy preferences of the party at any given time. And so there's a lot of different ways that these platforms are sort of generated. There's a lot of historical kind of precedent behind those. As we'll talk about, the political party system is very dynamic and has been over the life of U.S. government and really over probably your own life. In fact, I would say it absolutely has been. We've seen major party shifts during this time period. So let's talk a little bit more about that. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the organization of political parties. So typically a political party will formulate their platform at the national level, and they do this through conventions and other high-level meetings. These are private organizations. They're not government organizations, so they can do a lot of this in private. They don't have to in most cases aren't subject to open records laws, that sort of thing. So a lot of what goes on is behind closed doors. Now, at the national party level, obviously you have national party leadership, and generally they're going to set most of the platform of this is what we believe and this is what we support. Now, state parties may have legislative priorities that align with their state or maybe specific to their state. So naturally, a state like Texas, for instance, if the Republican Party in Texas has taken up, border security as a major platform issue there in the state. And so state political parties will have their own conventions, and they'll also actually issue their own platforms. And sometimes those, for the most part, they align with the national party. Sometimes you sort of see one-off things. In fact, we've seen this recently due to polarization as Republican parties have grown, the political parties have grown a little bit more polarized over time. We're starting to see, some state parties break off and do things a little bit differently, but generally under the same banner. At the county level, you have political party activity as well. So generally, county level activities are being organized by the state political party. And so you can see it's this kind of hierarchy here. And it's designed this way to essentially get things done, right? You can't have the national party really managing things at a county level. You kind of need a state party to do that. So you have the county organization, and then typically within the county, you have precincts. And so that can be could be akin to similar to zip codes, for instance, or smaller areas of focus there. So maybe the Democratic Party in Wake County will have X number of precincts, and then they'll have precinct chairs, which is usually a voluntary role. And the purpose of that person in that leadership position is basically to gather up votes and support just within that precinct. So again, it just devolves into these smaller levels that make it a little bit more easier for the parties to garner support kind of in the public there. So let's talk about the history of political parties here. As I mentioned, the cool thing about parties is that they've changed considerably over time. We've had some different political parties, but generally always a two-party system, and for the most part, I'll talk about that here in a bit. The other thing I want to drive home is that it's something that most people get, but a lot of people don't. Is that the parties that we see today, the Democratic Party of today or the Republican Party of today, have changed considerably. In fact, they've completely reversed their policy positions in a lot of areas over time. For someone to say, the Republican Party of Lincoln is akin to the Republican Party today, or the Democratic Party of FDR is akin to the Democratic Party today, it just it isn't accurate. We'll talk about this here. So the first party system, we generally identify that as historians would say between 1792 and 1824 here. And this was really just an extension of that Federalist, anti-Federalist debate that we talked about considerably here. You had the anti-Federalists. They later became the Democratic Republican Party. So there was a party that was actually called the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party largely sort of died after its opposition to the War of 1812. So its opposition to the Second War with Great Britain, largely led to its dissolvement. Now, and that brings us to the second party system. So 1828 to 1854. So kind of that 25-year or so period leading up, kind of prior to the Civil War. The Democratic Republican Party ends up splitting, with the Democratic Party supporting the power of the president over Congress and opposing programs that would build up industry at the expense of farmers there. So you're starting to see this division. Here's where we get the Democratic Republican Party, but they don't necessarily look like they do today. The Republican contingent becomes essentially the Whigs, so that becomes the Whig Party. They favored modernizing the industrial economy. Later on, they end up being split over disagreements pertaining to slavery. But during this time period, the Republican, or what became the Whig Party, was really the party of northern industrialists and the urban contingent, whereas the Democratic Party emerged as sort of the party of the South and rural Americans. So that brings us to the third party system. So that takes us into the Civil War and the period after there. So the Republican Party emerges, from the ashes of what was previously the Whigs. Their big thing is they oppose slavery. They support federal intervention to modernize education and the economy. So the Republican Party at this time ends up becoming the party of sort of big centralized federal government. So again, when I speak to the fact that that's very contrary to how the party presents itself today, although at the state level, I would disagree that they're actually following that platform. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, was comprised of rural and Southern voters. So you remember we talked a little bit about how during that period after the Civil War, Reconstruction was highly contentious. And so this led to further polarization. And this is where you really have the separation of the Republicans and Democrats. The two parties moved further away from each other. Democrats took hold of the U.S. South, became the party of the working class, if you will, and Republicans gained support in the North and with urban voters and also with black voters as well. So again, they're riding the coattails of Lincoln, and they become the party of Lincoln, and sort of not kind of how we would associate what we would associate those parties with necessarily today. The fourth party system really begins with the proliferation of the Industrial Revolution. You've got the same political parties, but the Republican Party becomes even more entrenched in its support for industry, while Democrats considerably, side with labor. So they become the party of labor. This becomes, very important because we have, several Republican presidents during this time period leading up to the Great Depression. And when that occurred, there was a lot of blame sort of attributed to the Republican Party presidents. Democrats saw an opportunity, particularly in the South, where so many people were so dramatically affected by the Great Depression and sort of its economic impacts. And so this is where you start to see some transformation occur as well. So that brings us to the fifth party system. So Republicans lost a lot of support. It's a great result of the Great Depression here. Democrats emerge as the party of the working class and also of minority voters. You have obviously FDR and the New Deal policies during this time period, which were extremely popular in the South there. But that sort of transitions, and I'll mention too, Republicans were sort of split during this time period as well, because you had moderates in the Northeast, but then you had conservative Republicans elsewhere there. And this creates sort of this great schism in the Republican Party here, with those moderates actually losing out. And so that was sort of the last time that the Republican Party was generally associated with urban sort of northern territories. That faction of it ends up breaking off there. All of this leads us to the sixth party system, and that's the one political scientists and historians would say we're in today. 1968 to present, Republicans end up seeing growing support as Southern white Democrats shift their allegiance. And so what was occurring is, when we talked about the Democratic Party was the party of the working class in the South, but this is also, if you remember, the time period of a lot of civil rights legislation and civil rights focus. It's somewhat akin, I was talking to someone the other day, to, obviously we're going through this period right now where there's a lot of attention on identity and diversity and those sorts of issues in sort of the political sphere, and you have, this is very contentious. Well, this is very similar to kind of how it was during the civil rights era here, and in the South, again, this many Southerners felt that the Democratic Party had abandoned them by focusing on civil rights. Again, the South was very conservative, very religious. This did not align, with their prevailing belief in sort of traditional families and that sort of thing. And so you see really the schism that's emerged here that still exists today. Republican parties gain a lot of support. In the 1980s, the Republican Party aligned itself more formally with the religious right. And so they garnered a lot of the support of evangelicals in the South. And that was really sort of the end of Democratic Party influence for much of the American South there. So again, sixth period, increasing polarization and focus on social values issues. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about. Are we emerging into a separate party system here? I don't think yet. But I do think that circumstances are primed for some changes and some adaptations. If you look, obviously, the Republican Party is having a little bit of an identity crisis, because by all predictive measures, it should have done really well in the midterm election last year, and it did not. And so, there is some talk and discussion of whether or not the Republican Party in its current form, survives if moderates reemerge that were sort of kicked out of the party over the last few years, reemerge and sort of create a new party. Obviously, lots of interesting questions that are sort of fascinating to kind of think about. Duck's here. He says, I seem to remember a few third parties in there. The Bull Moose Party, Donald Duck Party, the Rent is Too Damn High Party. Were they all relevant? The Donald Duck Party was actually in Sweden. But anyways, look, that's the interesting thing here. So most, casual observer of American politics would say third parties don't matter. The one major national election that any is really sort of won in recent history, Jesse Ventura, who was a former Navy SEAL and actor. He was in the original Predator movie, if you've seen that. He ended up winning the gubernatorial election in Minnesota as a member of the Reform Party. Third parties have shifted issue focus, though. So, Ralph Nader back in the day, most of you are probably too young to remember, but he regularly was included in presidential debates as a third party candidate. Never garnered a lot of support, but he did bring a lot of attention to consumer and environmental protections. And then there has been quite a bit, looked at in terms of the 1992 presidential race. That was when Ross Perot, the Texas, billionaire, jumped into the race there, and he ended up winning 19% of the vote. It wasn't enough to win the election, but political scientists analyzed that election and determined that cost George H.W. Bush the race, and is the reason that Bill Clinton ended up winning the election there. So do they matter? Yes, but not necessarily in the way that you might be thinking of. So that brings us to Dovegers Law. So we often get this question of, why is it that we can only have two sort of viable political parties? Well, there's actually a political science explanation for this. Maurice Dovegers, French, he gives an explanation here. He says, look, it's our political system that was created through these institutions this winner-take-all plurality voting system is to blame. He said when you have a winner-take-all system, and what we mean by that is that whether you get 51% of the vote or you get 80% of the vote, obviously those are different levels of support. It doesn't matter. You get 100% of the win because you get the seat in Congress that's associated with that. Because of that system, Duverger argues that third-party votes are essentially seen as a waste. So there may be a third-party candidate that you very much align with, but you know that they're not going to garner enough support, and so maybe you vote for, you make a preference-based vote for, the lesser of the remaining evils, and that's one of the things that's historically held third parties back. With only one winner, potential third parties will, according to Duverger, eventually align themselves with the existing parties. Because it's problematic if you have a policy platform and things you want to see get done, and you're only polling 20% of the vote. At 20%, you're not winning any races, so you're not able to get any of your issues. We saw this actually probably 15 years ago with the Tea Party. So that was a very conservative offshoot of the Republican Party, probably actually more similar to what the Republican Party looks like today. A lot of focus on taxation and other conservative issues. They emerged as a third party, but it was clear and from the beginning that they needed to align themselves with the Republican Party and then just sort of get their people elected as Republicans. And historians and political scientists and other observers would say that that's largely why we have the Republican Party we do today, was the efforts of the Tea Party and these very sort of right-wing groups that came in, started winning individual races that over time gave them sort of more direction, allowed them to sort of take over control of the Republican Party. One of the things they did as a result was that they essentially kicked out moderates. They use the term rhino Republican in name only to get rid of Republicans who are seen as more moderate and not as aligned with kind of the party's sort of new direction there. The Democratic Party, to a smaller extent, has seen some similar sort of movement, again, in that, a lot of this is tied to the decline in labor unions, which historically was where the Democratic Party got a lot of their support. Labor unions are less relevant today, but at the same time, too, a lot of the labor union membership of the Democratic Party wasn't as aligned with the social policy issues that the Democratic Party was focusing on. So when you're looking at matters such as equality, gay rights, civil rights, that sort of thing, that wasn't something that was as appealing to the average union-based Democratic Party voter, and so they've seen some changes as well as those individuals have sort of left the party. Plurality voting systems. So as opposed to this winner-take-all system, some democracies have plurality systems. We do not. Duverger argued that proportional representation systems, these are known as, often are employed in Europe, encourage third-party membership, and that's why in most European political systems you see thriving third parties. So in these systems, political parties win representation relative to the vote they received. So if there are 10 seats in a political district that are up for vote for parliament, a party that secures really just 10% of the vote would still receive one of those 10 seats, is the basic idea behind the system there. This has some good parts about it and some not so good parts about it. The good part about it is that it encourages more options, and so the political parties have to do more to appeal to voter preferences, and it matters, right? So the difference between 10 to 20%, if you ignore a third party in a European parliamentary system, they can pick up an additional seat pretty easily. On the flip side, it does provide an avenue for extremists to create a presence in the parliamentary system or in this type of political system. So, historically, the best known example was the German Socialist Workers' Party, which became the Nazi Party, ended up at its peak when Hitler took over, only had about 30% of seats in parliament there, but they were able to, through various actions, so they were very much a minority group, not terribly popular, but you could see how they ended up leveraging that to essentially take over the party. And one of the first things that dictators tend to do is they tend to decertify the other political parties, and you see this in just about every system. There's actually a state legislator in Florida that's trying to do this right now, strangely enough. But that's one of the things they'll do is they'll just get rid of all other political parties to eliminate all sort of opposition. Now, what I've been describing over the course of this lecture of these parties sort of shifting and adapting and voters sort of moving around, when parties change, we refer to this as party realignment. Political parties are subject to substantial change over time, and it doesn't occur overnight. It's something that builds over time. But the process is known as party realignment. It typically takes about 2 decades for this to occur, and it's usually sort of centered around a specific election. Realignment refers to the process by which voters switch parties based on preferences. So again, the most notable one in relatively recent history, as I mentioned, was Democrats in the South leaving the Democratic Party over civil liberties issues and civil rights issues in the 1960s, 1970s time period here. Now, de-alignment is a term, that's a different term. It refers to the process by which voters leave parties and identify as independents. And as we'll talk about here in a second, de-alignment is actually probably the fastest growing trend and something that political scientists are really interested in. So let's talk about those partisan identity trends here. So partisan identity, so the portion of the population that identifies with either the Republican Party, Democratic Party, or a third party has been on decline for the past several decades. If you look to reasons for this, data suggests that political polarization is largely to blame for this. So we in the second half of the class here are going to get a lot more into sort of the math behind things, and I don't know if I can actually just draw a picture on a bill to sort of illustrate this. I wish I had, if this was a regular class, in-person class, I'd be able to do that. But let's think of a normal distribution here. So a normal distribution curve looks like this, right? Where you have most voters are here in the center. So we would call them moderates. Most Americans are pretty moderate. And on the extreme ends here, you get fewer people. So we'll say that this is extreme ideological conservative, extreme ideological liberal on this end here. And there are fewer people here. The problem is our political system is increasingly looking like, the anticipation is killing you, something like this, where our actual politicians, our representatives, our members of Congress are more likely to be on the ends here, very few moderates in the middle. What that means is that the policies that are discussed and brought up tend to be very extreme, and they aren't reflective necessarily of the needs of the general population there. And political scientists would argue that that's what's driving people to be less likely, to align with political parties. Okay, let's talk about some other phenomenon tied to partisan identity and some of the demographics and other things that are statistically related to it, because it really tells an interesting sort of story here. So let's talk about the relationship between partisan identity and age here. Historically, this has always been a strong predictor of partisan identity. Age has nearly half of the youngest voters. So if you look at that 18 to 34 age bracket there, identify as independents. As voters age, they're actually more likely to identify with a political party. And if you think about this, so it's interesting. As you get older, government policy probably more directly impacts you, right? I think about when I was 21, and even as somebody who was studying political science in graduate school, there was not a lot that the government did that directly impacted me. I wasn't making enough money to actually owe taxes. I didn't have kids in a public education system. Yeah, my life was, relatively easy. I don't think that's the case for young people today. There's a lot of things that directly impact you guys. But anyways, as people age, they, their life becomes more entangled in the government and what the government's doing. So, again, just using personal examples. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I have twin 10-year-old boys. All of a sudden, they couldn't go to school. They were here. I was not working from home at the time, but my wife was, who's an attorney. very difficult for us. Certain schools, the schools that we left in Florida, were going back to school. Wake County schools were not. We became very interested in this topic, and I, for the first time ever, wrote a school board member to say, "Hey, you gave us the option of sending our kids back. Why are you taking it away from us?" The other thing, obviously, is taxation. So the more money, more problems, right? So the more money you make, the more heavily you get taxed, and sometimes as you get older, you get surprising tax bills, and so people naturally become more interested in the political system and how it works. One of the other things too is that depending on your situation, you might have now more time. So most young people I know are working a job and going to school, and so maybe you don't have as much time to pay attention to politics. And then the other thing too is that the reverse is that the political parties know that they're getting support from older Americans, so they're not saying or doing a lot to necessarily appeal to young voters, because historically young voters haven't been a considerable portion of their support there. Middle-aged voters are more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans. And again, this is national average. This isn't breaking it out by any other factors here. Though as people age, as you can see there, they're more likely to identify with the Republican Party. The million-dollar question here that it'd be great if any of you become political scientists, if you can figure this out. I think this is sort of the holy grail of public opinion and vote choice questions is it age that drives our policy preferences, or are we carrying sort of generational preferences with us as we age? And so it's an interesting thing to look at too as you age. I will say that without talking about my politics, I will say at various points in my life, I've been a member of both political parties. I would say as I've aged, I've become more moderate in my political beliefs, and that's partly a function of reading more and learning more and realizing that things aren't maybe as dichotomous as they're led to be. But I would just think about it for yourself and just keep that in mind as you age, because it's really interesting to know, does a 65-year-old today will their vote preferences be similar to a 65-year-old in 20 years? Or will that 65-year-old bring those unique experiences to their life at that point? Right now, we don't have a really good idea of how that works. Party identity and gender here. So this is another factor that's strongly correlated with partisanship. Men are more likely than women to identify as political independents, so to not have party identity. This distinction has grown really since 2008. Men with partisan preferences are more likely to identify as Republicans, though. So those that do identify with the party are more likely to be Republicans. Women, on the other hand, more likely to identify as Democrats than either Republicans or independents. Historically, the Democratic Party in its recent version has pulled a lot of support from women, and you'll often hear during an election cycle they'll discuss suburban soccer moms and that effect, because they really end up being a swing voter within the gender there. So rural women are overwhelmingly conservative. Urban women overwhelmingly, progressive. The suburban, those that live in suburban areas tend to gravitate to the Democratic Party. But one of the things that was noticed, for instance, when Trump, won his election, was that largely what ended up being a difference maker was that he did really well with suburban women. The second election, he didn't do as well, and that's the sort of the specific social group that political scientists would point to and say they really sort of turned the election there. These distinctions, why do they exist? A lot of it's due to policy preferences, right? So, and again, we're making generalizations here. We call these archetypes instead of stereotypes because it sounds better, but this is all based on data that's been collected at the aggregate level. Women on the aggregate level tend to place greater salience on social policy issues, things such as education and healthcare. Men place more emphasis on economy and defense. And so that drives a lot of these preferences where you look at how the parties have aligned themselves over time. Party identity and formal education. So it is related to education here. So more highly educated, with those with formal educations, individuals tend to be more likely to support the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Voters who identify as some college or less more likely to identify as Republican. And just to make it clear here, I'm not conflating formal education with intelligence in any way. I was the first person in my family to earn a 4-year degree. On my dad's side of the family, I wouldn't describe them as unintelligent. Actually, about half of them are pretty unintelligent, but not all. A lot of my father never went to college. Very intelligent guy. So I don't want to make it seem that way. It actually has more to do with geography. So as the Republican Party sort of has come to dominate the American South, you just have individuals living in the American South that are less likely to have a formal college education. So that's what really sort of drives it more than anything. Race and religion, while we're hitting all the fun topics that'll get me fired, also factor into partisan identity here. Look, again, I joke about this, but as political scientists, I told you at the beginning of the class, we look at this like rats running through a maze. Like it's, they're binding, it's like programming, right? Religious 1, non-religious 0. I just look at the numbers and how they go into a model and what gets spit out here. But we have noticed some trends with regard to religion. So evangelical Christians demonstrate an incredibly strong preference for the Republican Party. Like I said, a lot of that started in the civil rights era. It really sort of flourished in the 1980s, where the Republican Party is sort of intentionally identified with the religious right. That is an interesting one for the future of the Republican Party, because evangelical Christians as a portion of the population are on decline. It's over time there are fewer and fewer Americans, but they are very energetic and energized in the political process there. So they're more likely to protest and get involved on issues that are important to them. Jewish and Catholic voters are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. There's some caveats there. So the Republican Party has made headways with Jewish voters by aligning itself with the conservative bloc in Israel. So the current government, which is sort of a continuation of Benjamin Netanyahu's government, is very conservative, and so that has garnered some support. In fact, that's largely why Republicans have done so well in Florida the past couple of years, is because they've made headways in South Florida, which is heavily Jewish. Catholic voters, again, remain tend to be Democratic voters, although they split on the issue of abortion. So depending on how important abortion is to a Catholic voter, they may vote Republican. And we call those single issue voters here. African Americans have consistently supported Democratic presidential nominees at nearly 90% or greater level. The Republican Party has made some efforts over time to garner votes among Black voters, and it's largely been a losing effort. They just haven't made a lot of headway there. If you look at Hispanic and Latino voters, so this is an interesting one. I published an article several years ago in the consumer space in the market research world about how, I don't like when people talk about like the Hispanic consumer, because if you know anything about Hispanic and Latino culture, is that it's very heterogeneous, meaning, cultures differ considerably based on where you're looking at. So it's not really fair to say, Hispanic voters are a single voting bloc, because they're not. If you look at it, they tend to demonstrate a preference for Democrats. But it's variable. For instance, Cuban Americans, again, another place Republicans have made large headway in Florida with. The Cuban population in South Florida, they tend to identify as Republican because, and historically, if you think about it, it's in response to the communist takeover of Cuba under the Castro regime and the overthrow of the Batista regime before it. A lot of families obviously lost land or had to move, or people were in prison. It was a very difficult situation there. And so that has had lingering sort of impacts on the policy preferences. And so Republicans, speaking very much from an anti-communism sort of platform in South Florida, have done really well as a result. Okay, so the duck's back. He says, so wait a minute, you're saying that you can predict someone's partisanship by knowing their demographics. Are you suggesting people are predestined towards their political beliefs? Sort of. So partisanship is a function of ideology, right? And we're going to talk more about ideology here in the coming weeks, but think about it as what you believe, right? What you believe is heavily influenced by your experiences in life, which are strongly related to your identity traits. So let's think about it. A white male evangelical Christian that grows up in the South is going to be socialized in a very distinct manner compared to, say, an urban black female, right? You're going to be exposed to different information, different values, different beliefs. Circumstances are going to be entirely different. So it makes sense that those experiences would then roll into different, political beliefs and ideologies. So really, it's just sort of a reflection of everything you sort of encountered there. I've, had this discussion, and people don't feel comfortable about this when you say, oh, of course you believe that because you grew up here, or of course you believe that because your parents believe this, because everybody likes to think that, no, I've given deep thought to all these issues, and this is why I believe the way I do. Data doesn't lie. Statistics are pretty legit, and what it shows is that overwhelmingly your beliefs are reflective of the environment that you grew up in, and we'll talk more about that pretty soon here. So what's the future of partisanship here? There's a lot of questions at play. Will younger voters, again, getting back to this question I mentioned earlier, will they age into existing ideology patterns, or will they bring something new? The Hispanic Latino population is the fastest growing in the U.S. population. Political observers are very interested to see how that impacts partisan preferences. Most of what I've read recently is that a lot of the historical effects sort of start to disappear after the second or third generation, meaning that as your family gets further removed from whatever country that your ancestors sort of came from, that really sort of dilutes that kind of political effect there. Can polarization continue, or will parties be forced to moderate their agendas or platforms? So can we see, we've seen it most actively with the Republican Party and its very admitted shift to the right. The Democratic Party, in the perspective of many, has made a similar shift to the left there. How far can you go before you start losing elections and it starts impacting you? I think that was the big question that came out of the midterm elections this last time here. And then will we see some intra-party schisms here that occur and result in new parties or even a new era of realignment here, right? Will we see moderate Republicans who've been displaced by the party but don't identify with the Democratic Party? Will they start their own thing, or will they, sort of end up in the Democratic Party and push it further to the right? These are all sort of fascinating questions there. I realized I got to give you a code word, and I forgot to do it earlier. I was going to mention Cuba because I like Cuba in the sense that I've traveled there and I've worked with the Cuban government and had Cuban friends, both very anti-Castro and very ambivalent towards the Castro family. Anyways, grown up, living in Tampa 15 years, the Cuban population, Cuban community is hugely important there. So all that to say, I needed to give you a code word. So make it Cuba, C-U-B-A. There's a really great Netflix documentary, Cuba Libre, that really sort of covers the history of Cuba. Actually, I highly recommend it if you want to sort of primer on kind of how things have gone there. But Cuba, your code word for this week. So that's it for political parties. I will give my sort of remarks here at the end to say that look, if you're a strong member of a political party and I said something that strikes you as offensive or you don't agree with, hey, reach out to me. I'd be happy to discuss it with you. Everything I cover from the perspective of a political scientist, it's not from a basis of emotion. I am just fascinated by watching the rats run through the maze. And so a lot of what's going on in contemporary times that I may have commented or mentioned on comes from that perspective there. So not meaning to hurt anyone's feelings and stuff. I know some people are very heavily aligned, just trying to, give you some data to give you some insights into how these systems kind of work. So hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.